Round 5 at the London Chess Classic was another long day, and this game actually lasted the longest. Viswanathan Anand with white against Veselin Topalov. Neither player enjoying great form at the moment, but it was clear that both wanted a really good fight today. Topalov played the Najdorf variation, and Vichy played a very interesting opening variation, managing to castle queenside, which automatically gave the game a very double-edged character. And you can see Vichy has advanced his g-pawn up the board. Black's king is kind of wandering around the middle, but pretty safe actually behind these pawns, and has the bishops. This is a critical moment in the game. Black to play, and we expected Toppy to play a5, threatening b4 to open up the c file, open up the queen side. And here, well, it's rather double-edged. White should be okay. Maybe he throws in a knight d5 or something. But we thought black should be fine in this position. Instead, rather uncharacteristically, Topalov played passively here. He wanted to prevent this positional threat of bishop g4 exchanging off the light square bishops. So he played queen d7. Vichy reinstated this positional threat of bishop g4 with queen g3, and then once again a passive move from Topalov, moving the rook backwards, allowing bishop g4, and Topalov exchanged everything off. This is really exactly what Anand wants from a strategic point of view, because now you can see with the exchange of those bishops, the knight has total control over this beautiful d5 square, and we have actually a textbook position. But Topalov had appreciated that he has defensive resources in this position. That pawn on g5 is on a dark square, so Topalov shifted the bishop round to attack the pawn. This is what he was pinning his defense on. Means that White's rook has to keep defending that pawn. But Vichy can still make progress on the queen side, and he did that by advancing his king and then his pawns up the board. And, well, White can isolate a pawn here with exchanging pawns. That would probably be very good for White, so Toppy defended against that. But in this case, Anand can actually create a passed b pawn, and this of course is extremely dangerous. So black playing really passively here, and Anand managing to make progress. So Toppy is just waiting with his pieces at the moment, and now this rook starts to reroute. Toppy's still waiting, and just waited for a moment. That was the 40th move. They've made the time control, so Vichy just repeating the position. And now it's the time to take the plunge. White could play king c4 here, support the b pawn, but then rook a7, and the rook comes down to hassle the king from behind. Maybe look at these pawns. Black has counterplay. That's why Vichy played rook a1, preventing the rook going to the a file. But in order to activate, he has to give up that g pawn. But okay, to get something, you've got to give something. Now the king comes forward to support the b pawn. The bishop came back again, wants to blockade on b6. Now, if the b pawn advances, then bishop b6. No, not so clear. Black should be able to defend that one. So she waited for a moment. f3. Very clever move. So means the bishop isn't attacking the pawn, and he's just solidifying his pawn chain, and also saying to black, well, okay, what exactly are you doing? It's not so easy to wait in this position. So almost a kind of minor Zugzwang here. I mean, maybe the best is to play bishop b6, but, you know, White can still make progress here. It's interesting to see what happens if that rook tries to switch round to the king side, for example. Anyway, Topalov played f5. Well, whatever black plays here involves a compromise. This in some ways creates some counterplay because it isolates this pawn and creates a passed g-pawn, but it does open the 7th rank from this side of the board, and Vichy latched onto that straight away with rook h1. Black exchanged, and g5. I mean, there's not much better. Now b5, and this is another crunch moment in the game, and very, very difficult to defend. Well, Toppy waited with the rook here. By the way, if you play rook a7 here, then of course rook check skewers and wins the rook. There's king c8, that's possible, but this looks very powerful. At first, when we were watching the game, we thought that rook g7 would give black counterplay, but it looks like white is actually going to get there first by bringing the king in. And here, it looks rather scary, like a new queen. Knight c7 is incredibly powerful, followed by b7 check and takes, and basically white can force. Well, let's see it in action. This is gonna be mate like that. What else? Well, perhaps g4 is the best move here, to give that pawn, but then to activate the rook. I mean, I still don't know whether this is a win for white or not, but at least this rook is active. Compare this with the game. Topalov just dropped the rook back. Still a pawn up, but passive. And here, certainly, he made a mistake. I think he should just drop back. I mean, this looks absolutely awful. But, well, perhaps I'm missing something, but I don't quite see how white can make progress in this position. It looks dreadful. But, well, white is just going around in circles here. But I could be missing something. Topalov played king e6, which looks more active, but actually leaves black in a terrible situation because, of course, if that bishop moves, then rook e7 is mate. It's pretty unpleasant, and after king b4, black is in Zugzwang, which whatever move he makes, it compromises his position. So let's go through some alternatives. Well, first of all, bishop f6 allows knight c7 mate. And if the bishop goes the other way, bishop b6, rook e7 is mate. And if rook a8, now we can push the pawn. And it goes all the way. And king here with the threat, knight b4 and queen. So Topalov found nothing better than to play g4, and Vichy scooped the pawn. But this wasn't the end of it. Still difficult to crack black's position here. There was a bit of shuffling. King had to go back. Now this is rather different when the g-pawn has gone. White can crack black's position, it looks like. So Topalov just waiting here. He's completely passive. Look at that fantastic knight dominating the bishop. And here's a crunch moment again. If the king goes back to c8, this is, well, we looked at this position previously, except there was a black pawn on g5. In this case, knight e7 check is a win. If the king steps up, then it's a discovered check, winning the rook. And if this is taken, then this is a winning rook and pawn endgame. Exchanging rooks is the threat with a winning king and pawn endgame, and if rook b6, then the king just comes round to hassle the rook, and this is going to be a win for white. So the king came up, and once again black finds himself in Zugzwang here after king b4. Incidentally, b6 is not winning. Obviously bishop takes would allow rook e7 mate, but rook b6, that looks like a draw to me. Even though white's king comes in, I don't think white can make any more progress in this position. But instead, Vichy played king b4, excellent move, and it's Zugzwang. Topi found a really interesting defence. He played bishop a5 check. Now, this is insufficient. There are two very good moves in this position. One of them, let's show the idea first. So if takes, then black is playing for stalemate, but in fact, obviously if you take it, it's stalemate, but in fact white can escape this by playing in this position knight b4, and white should win that. But there's another even more subtle move, king a4. Threat rook e7 mate, and when the bishop goes back we play rook a7, and again the position is Zugzwang. For example, rook c8, b6, and this pawn is rolling home. But instead Vichy played king c4. That was, well, he must have seen something he didn't like, but there were two good winning moves there. And he shuffled for a bit. Remember, this was a really long game, and it is very hard to calculate properly after a few hours, I can assure you. But Vichy shuffled, and I think he realised around here that actually one of those variations was winning, and well, black can repeat this position, and after rook a7 it's Zugzwang again. But this time Topalov, well, he didn't even bother repeating the position. He activated his rook with rook c1, but this is now winning for white. That pawn is just, well, ultimately unstoppable unless you give up material. So Topalov took. Now you just have to keep your one remaining pawn, but in fact white can do that very easily. This is how the game finished. King stepped out of the pin. I mean, it looks weird to have the king at this end of the board. In fact, it's really useful. And in this position, okay, you're just holding the pawn. King threatens to activate, but rook g4 is a very clean finish. You can see once the knight lands on d5, then the white's position is completely impregnable. It's a fortress, you can't budge it. But in fact, black's king is in a mating net here. Let's see what happens. King e8, we can use that beautifully active king. And after check, rook g6, mate. Poetry. Wonderful strategic performance by Viswanathan Anand, but we have to question Topalov's decision way back on the 24th move to play so passively. It didn't quite work out in the end. Probably with best play he could have drawn, but very risky to fall back like that and give your opponent so much play. So after 5 rounds, well, all the other games were drawn, so after 5 rounds the leaders are still Maxime Vacher-Legrave, Anish Giri and Hikaru Nakamura, all on 3 out of 5. Wednesday is a free day, a rest day in the Classic, and round 6 will be played on Thursday.